Welcome to an evening with Nick Dunhill, who is a member of the Gauge Guild Technical Committee. And tonight he is continuing his series of presentations on scratch building a locomotive. This time he shows us how to build a footplate, and it follows the boiler, smoke box, firebox and footplate demonstrations from earlier sessions. And if you've not seen them already, you can still watch them via the Gauge Guild YouTube channel. Just search for Nick Dunhill. If anyone has any specific requests, please let us know via chat so Nick can cover these too. So, welcome to Nick. Thank you for joining us again. And over to you.
Thank you, James. Welcome everybody. I think this is the fourth or the fifth instalment of building the scratch building a loco? I can't remember now. But I think it'd probably be good if we started with a recap of what we've done. And to do that, it's probably best if I flip you to my overhead camera. How's that? Should be focused now. Is that in reasonable focus, the drawing I've got in front of me? Right. So we've kind of moved on a little bit. I had to do a little bit of preparation before we came to tonight, and this is a loco that I've been building through this series of demonstrations, and this is a drawing of it just there. I think first time round I did the smoke box, second time was the boiler, but I also did the firebox at the same time, and I think the third one was the footplate, and I also did the cab when I did the footplate presentation as well. So what you can see here is that I've kind of soldered them all together. When I made the formers for all of these individual boiler items, I kind of made a hole in the centre that you can see just there. So really all I had to do was push a rod through the lot to align them. And then I stood them on a flat plate so that the bottom of the smoke box and the bottom of the firebox were on a piece of plate glass, just a flat surface, and then tacked everything together. And you can see that the older ones. No, that's right. I can. Do you want to mute yourself? Whoever's doing that. Thank you. And you can see what I've then done is attached some boiler bands. I know a lot of people leave the boiler bands off, and I know that the painters sometimes get a bit irritated when you do put boiler bands on. But I think they're very good at disguising the little gaps that crop up between the firebox and the boiler and the smoke box and the boiler. And you can see I've also added there's a brass disc there that's to represent the sort of, I don't know, what would you call it? It's kind of a cover, isn't it, between the smoke box and the boiler that covers up the bolts that bolt the two together. Anyway, so that's the boiler unit now assembled, and obviously I've kind of soldered it to the front of the cab and the footplate there, so we've got the kind of beginnings of a loco there, really. And I did that because I think you probably need to have done that before you start making a chassis, because as you can see what I've done, if you zip back to the video about the footplate, you'll see that I, at that stage, decided how wide the outside of the frames were going to be. Now, I kind of like to have the part of the chassis that sticks up above the footplate as part of the frames, part of the chassis. I know in a lot of commercial kits, for instance, you'll get the part of the frame that sticks up above the chassis as an upstand along the edge of the footplate, and that's fine. But if you do that, if you look down there when the loco's finished, you'll see that there's a step in the frames. Because the kit manufacturer will probably put the frames above the footplate at the prototypical spacing, and then below the footplate manufacturers, I think, always punt for something like 26 millimeters between the outside of the frames, which I think is a bit too generous. I mean, well, it certainly is on a loco like this that's effectively only an 040, because really you don't need any end float on the driving wheels at all, and probably only a tiny bit of end float on the front wheel here. I'm not sure whether this is a radial truck or just a truck in a chassis. Sorry, in a horn guide here. I think it's just a truck in a horn guide. So probably the real loco would only run with a bit of side-to-side end float on this, and it wouldn't pivot like you would get if it were a radial truck or a bogie or something like that. And I think I always shoot for something like 27 or something like that. I know it's only an extra millimeter, but however, you know, the disadvantage with doing what I do is that you end up with the base of the smoke box being a little bit narrower than it should be prototypically. But I figure that whichever way you choose, there's going to be inaccuracies because of the way that fine scale's defined. And I sort of prefer to do it this way because then you don't get the step in the chassis when you peer underneath the boiler. So that's kind of where I got to with this. And that allowed me then to go on and sort of draw a chassis. And you can see what I've done really is I've just picked up all the dimensions off the drawing. I started, the chassis is obviously, the length of the chassis is the distance between the insides of the buffer beam and the drag beam. So you can see what I've done on this piece of paper here is quite crudely drawn at the shape of the chassis. You can pick up the shape of the chassis here from this drawing. I mean, this drawing is just a line drawing. It's not a GA or anything like that. But if you've got a GA of the chassis, obviously this is going to be a much easier sort of project. But as it is, I kind of took the basic shape off the drawing. You can see that the chassis is actually quite shallow. It only comes to just below the centre line of the wheels, but it does stick up very slightly here. Look above the foot plate. So I kind of measured the overall height from the top here. Well, actually, I didn't. I made my datum point at the foot plate and then measured up from the foot plate and then down from the foot plate as well. And so you can see on this drawing what I've done is I've marked where the curves start and end, and then, you know, where the next one does and where the centre for the wheel is, and just measured everything from the front of the loco, and then quite simply just marked it out on a sheet of nickel silver. And if you cut it out, you end up with something like this, which is the basic chassis, which sort of fits there. Actually, you can see that this is, the chassis is a bit longer than the drawing. I discovered to my cost that when somebody emails a drawing as a PDF and then you download it and then print it out, ends up shrinking it. And I found that out the hard way because this is the smoke box that I made in the original, the very first An Evening With, when I showed people how I made the smoke box. And the drawing is actually 3% undersized, which means that, as you can see, annoyingly, the smoke box was too small. So I actually ended up having to make another one that was actually the right size. So my advice to you is whenever you start pulling dimensions off a drawing, always pick a dimension on the drawing that's marked. Say, for instance, here, 8'3" You know, therefore, what that would be in scale 7. You know what it is on the drawing, and then you can do a quite simple simultaneous equation then to work out your conversion factor, which is what I did. So all of these measurements are all multiplied by the conversion factor. And I think it's quite important that you do that. what I've elected to do with this loco, I did speak to the guy who I'm sort of building it for, and he decided that he didn't want inside motion on the loco. So what I've done, as you can see, is I've cut out a space there around the front and rear axle boxes. And the dimension of this is such that it'll accept one of those brass Slater's axle boxes. What would you call them? They're sort of a square thing, and they've got a slot down the middle, and it slides in and out of the slot there around there. And probably in the next, if I do another demonstration, probably in the next one, is I'll show you how I make and fit up my own sort of quite simple horn guides, horn cheeks to guide the horn block that goes inside of the axle box, and the same there. And the customer, the bloke who I'm making this for, he decided, not really the customer, I'm kind of doing it as a freebie. He decided he wanted to have the first driven axle there with the motor, driven by the motor. So I've just put a bog standard plain sort of top hat bearing in that axle box, and you'll see in a moment how that will help me out later. So the next thing I did, once I'd cut out a chassis, one chassis rail, was soldered this to a piece of nickel silver and cut round it, as simple as that really, you know, and then sort of file all the way around. So you've got two matching pieces. This is the other one just here. So I've now got a pair. And then the next step after that's to make all the frame stays. I mean, there's a variety of ways of doing this. I mean, back in the olden days, people just used to use a piece of, I don't know, brass rod or something that's drilled and tapped, I don't know, 8BA or something, and then you can just have some spaces that you put a screw through the outside of the chassis into the spacer. But what I've kind of elected to do is make some stays that are more or less in the sort of prototypical position. Although, of course, if you look at the drawing that I've got, you can see that there aren't really any positions for the frame stays marked on this drawing. But the kind of experience has told me that somewhere around the front here of the chassis, there's probably a drag beam of some sort. Although on these really old engines, you know, from the turn of the century, there probably isn't a drag beam. Often they just had some gussets, and you can see that this does have a gusset just there between the outside of the frame and the buffer beam. And they probably have something similar on the inside, and with a little bit of sort of strengthening where the hook goes through. The rear of the chassis probably does have a drag beam, and often that's kind of a box that's got two sort of horizontal members and a vertical member there. And what you usually find is that the drawbar for the tender goes all the way through the drag box and is attached to it, attached to the vertical member there. And you often find that the drag box here is used to mount the brake cylinder as well, you know, because it's a nice solid point to sort of attach it to. So with that in mind, I kind of guessed it a little bit. So what I've done here is, as you can see, I've cut out a series of stays. Now the stays are all basically just rectangles, and they're all cut out of nickel silver, and they're all cut out really accurately. They're cut to a width that gives you I'm pretty sure it's 27. Let's just give it a measure, just to, so I won't be accused later of blagging you all. It's get my vernier on that. Yeah, it is, look, it's 27. And so all of these rectangles are 27. So basically what I've done is I've cut a strip that's a strip of nickel silver that's 27 millimeters wide, and then just chopped pieces off it to give me the, you know, that dimension that I need. And I have to confess, I've kind of guessed this a little bit. You can see this is the drag beam, and kind of what I've got are two horizontal components that are the same width, and then a vertical component there. And I've made a measurement and made the vertical component right to the bottom of the chassis frame, and then up to the underside. This is where the underside of the footplate falls. And these are just measurements that I picked up off the drawing, and you can see I've sort of put them on my really crude drawing here and copied them off that. This one here is here. There's an element of it there, and what I suspect this one is the motion bracket, you know, that would support the slide bars. Usually on a loco, the cylinders are underneath the smoke box, and often they're just the cylinder is just the length of the smoke box. Although on some locos it does extend a little bit further. And that obviously depends on the crank throw, because the length of the cylinder has to be at least twice the crank throw, so that dimension times 2. But again, all I've done is I've made assume the cylinder block would be the same width as the smoke box there, so that bit there falls underneath the smoke box. The motion bracket, you can see the bottom of it protruding there. Now this would have been a great loco actually for putting inside motion in, because the boiler's pitched quite high, and the splashers stop here. And obviously with it being a tender loco, it hasn't got any water tanks on the side, so you can actually see pretty much all of the valve gear. So I think the fellows missed an opportunity there not to put the inside motion in it, but you never know. In a future episode, folks, I might be modifying this and putting the inside motion in it, so we'll just have to watch and find out. So that's the motion bracket. Now, pretty much always locos that also have a frame stay that falls just here, just in front of the firebox. But obviously I couldn't put that stay there because his intention is to drive this axle, which probably means that you'll have a gearbox that goes in sort of a horizontal orientation with a motor sort of sticking up there inside the firebox. That would seem the obvious way to do it to me. So this is actually a stay that I cut out. And it was actually originally going to be just here, you know, in this position here. I mean, maybe he's missed a trick as well. And perhaps a good way of doing this would have been to have driven the rear axle and put the gearbox here and this going up. And then you could have moved this stay to its correct position just in front of the smoke box here. And then that would have hidden, when you're kind of looking underneath it, that would have hidden the motor, and it would have hidden all the gears and things, you know. And if you then could be bothered to build the ash pan here, to go all the way down with the firebox and then build the ash pan on the bottom of it, then you would actually completely disguise the motor. There'd just be a little bit of a gear sticking out here, but I think that would be a good way of hiding all that. But hey ho. And the next stage, once I've cut the frames out, is obviously then to offer them up to the bottom of the footplate. Now that's kind of why I built the thing, because as you can see, I designed the frames so that and the footplate as well at more or less the same time. And you can see that there's a section of the chassis here that sticks out above the footplate, and it is actually part of the chassis. So, you know, that's all this cutout here in the footplate, it's all very carefully measured to accept the finished chassis. Although one of the things that I did overlook was that this bit of the frame here that sticks out above the footplate, also carries along and should go outside the firebox here, but obviously because the frames are narrower than they would be prototypically, and the smoke boxes as it would be prototypically, then they do come into conflict with each other. So what you can see I've had to do is chop a bit out of the frames there, you see, to relieve the frame for the bottom of the firebox. But of course, all of that's going to be hidden by this splasher assembly here, which I may get round to in a future presentation. But that is actually quite a complicated structure, I think. I think it's got a little sub splasher here that covers the boss here on the connecting rod, coupling rod, sorry, and then a splasher that's set inside from it. Although there's kind of a suggestion of it here on the drawing, but we'll come to that at a later presentation maybe. And I think doing it this way, it has kind of allowed me to to make the chassis a proper bespoke fit. You can see that what I was shooting for was for this part of this little section here of the frame and this section of the frame here to sit on the bottom of the foot plate here at the rear, and here all the way here at the front. And you can see that I've also designed the stairs so that they're flush with that section as well, so that all of this sits on the foot plate, and similarly there. And of course, what I really should have done before I assembled this was drilled through there for some fixing screws to hold the chassis, ultimately hold the chassis to the foot plate. But I suppose I can add those later, because inevitably I'll have to cut a hole in the front of the smoke box to fit a smoke box door, because often the cast smoke box doors are recessed on the inside. But that will allow me access to soldering a screw on the top of a nut on the top of the foot plate, or a screw, depending on which way you want to do it. And anyway, we'll come to that at a later stage, I'm sure. Another thing I was going to mention as well before we move on and make chassis was the coupling rods. I have to confess that I always cheat when it comes to coupling rods, because they're really, really awkward to make, especially if you don't have a milling machine, and I don't have a milling machine. And I'd literally have to cut that out by hand and then solder that over another sheet of nickel silver, and then cut that out and possibly make 3 laminations. But a friend of mine, Mick Davis, he was having some parts etched, and he's pretty good at CAD. And luckily, he took pity on me and drew them in CAD. And these rods are made up from 3 or 4 laminates of photo etched nickel silver, which was very kind of him. Which is kind of cheating, I think, isn't it, when I'm supposed to be scratch building? But there's always somebody out there that will do this for you. Lots of people who get parts photo etched. Kit manufacturers will often bung a credit card sized, kind of custom etch on the edge of a frame. It'll fill up a bit of space, and they'll get paid a few quid for it, so they'll be happy to do that. I mean, this would have been quite an awkward thing to have made. It would have been literally cutting it out like that out of a piece of nickel silver, and then making another one, and then another one. You probably need to make 6 laminations to make rods like that. So I was very grateful that he helped me out. And I have to say, when I'm building the loco, it's always the rods that I make first, because you'll see maybe in a later presentation that the way to always make sure that a loco runs is to, especially with this sort of arrangement where I'm putting my own axle box, my own horn block in there with some horn guides, you can actually use the rod then as a jig to making sure that the axle centres match the rods. I've got a set of these. I don't know whether people have ever come across something like this before, but they're 3/16 Stewie axles. They fit in the top hat bearing or the Slater's horn blocks or whatever it is that you're using, and you can see the pointy bits on the side accept the rods, and therefore you can put another one. I'll show you how to do that in a later episode. I'm kind of preempting things, aren't I? But I've got a jury axle out tonight to use as a location guide for soldering these two things together. So the stays are just sort of soldered vertically onto the one side of the frame. I've got a piece of aluminium that somebody machined for me on a milling machine years ago. It's actually a jig for fixing the front half of it's for fixing the cab onto a Princess Royal, David Andrews Princess Royal. But conveniently, everything's square. So what I always use that is as a, kind of a guide to making sure that everything's sort of soldered onto the frame at right angles. It's quite easy to tape the thing that you are trying to solder onto the block with a piece of insulation tape, and then you can move it around and make sure that the stays in the right place and is perpendicular to the frame. And it's they're the two keys to building a frame, really. And number one, to make sure that all of your stays are all the angles are right angles. Make sure it's dead square. Otherwise, and they all have to be exactly the same width. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling a little bit later on. And obviously, the other thing is to make sure that the two halves, the two frames, do match, are identical to each other. And obviously, I've picked up the positions of all of these stays. Well, partly using the drawing, but also partly using the finished loco. So, for instance, you know that the rear of the cylinder is that dimension away from the foot plate, and you know what that dimension is, so you know where the front of the cylinder should go there. The frame stays marked here. As I said, there's always a stay here, just in front of the firebox, and then there's always a drag box here at the back for the for the tender. So that's that structure there. And this is the way that I do it. I always fasten all the stays to one of the frames, making sure that everything's very, very, very square. And then when you've done that, you need to kind of sight a line down the frame to make sure that it is straight, because often when you get sheets of nickel silver, they're actually curved. But if you can, just need to sort of give it a tweak to make sure that everything's square it's in a straight line before you start assembling it. And I think that one's, if I put a straight edge on it, you can see it's very slightly out. So let's give that a bit of a tweak. There we go. Straighten that up enough. Wonderful. So that's our basic structure.
Nick, can we ask a few questions, please?
Yeah, go on, fire away.
Ian?
Okay, first question, Nick, is from Dr. Dave. Do you use a template to cut the slots for your axle boxes, stroke horn guides?
No. I've done so many of these. I just know how wide they need to be. They're nominally kind of 7mm look. I'm guessing that they're actually really 6mm, and what I've done is I've cut this slightly bigger, because then it allows the axle box to find its own centre when you use the rod as a jig. So the answer to his question is no. I just kind of, I know the axle box, the dimension of the hole down the middle is that dimension. This dimension here, look, that's 6. So I make that 7, and then the axle box can slide from side to side. But you find the centre using that, and then in a later presentation, you'll see that I'll locate the axle box using some angle iron or some angle brass with the rod and the jury axle holding the axle box in the right location. I know lots of commercial kits come with an half-etched line, don't they? And the half-etched line's often designed to fit one of those Slater's foldy-up gearbox, axle boxes, I think, isn't it? Is that right, would you say?
Yeah, that is right. Unfortunately, I've discovered recently that Slater's have stopped making those.
Oh, have they?
Yeah.
Well, that's a bit of a blow, isn't it, for everyone?
Yeah.
Next question. Sorry, Nick. Next question. From Philip Taylor in Virginia. Are all pieces of nickel silver the same, or do you use various thicknesses?
Well,
Dr. Dave again has asked, what thickness of nickel silver are you using?
Well, the chassis, I've cut everything out using 0.45. Now, perhaps our American viewer can tell me what that is in imperial. Is that 18 thou, 0.45?
No, it's 22. I'll look that up while we're thinking.
I know a lot of people use, a lot of commercial kits use 0.8, don't they, for the thickness of the chassis?
Yeah, just under 18 thou.
0.45 is 18 thou, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of commercial kits are done with all the chassis members you'll find are in 0.8. That must be about 22 thou, is it, or 20 thou or something? And you do get a very rigid chassis if you do that. But I find that 0.45, when you've got enough frame stays in there, does actually make the fabrication, quite stiff.
Mm.
So because there are lots of other things to go on this as well. Like there'll be other things soldered across the frames, like the rods that support the brake gear, for instance, and everything adds its little bit of rigidity. All of this is made out of 0.45, again, 18 thou, everything, which you would get in a commercial kit, apart from the boiler. And I think I mentioned in the presentation when I made the boiler, and probably the smoke box, that I always make these out of 0.3, because I've got some of those Metalsmiths rolling bars, slip rolling bars up there. And I'm not sure that they're very good at dealing with 0.45, 18 thou. They don't seem to want to roll it very nicely, and I've never really had much success. So I always make the boilers out of 0.3 nickel silver. I mean, it is very thin and it is quite awkward cutting it. And if you jink it while you're cutting it, basically the piece you've been cutting is scrap. But once it's rolled up again, it is quite rigid, especially, once it's rolled up and it's got the formers soldered into both ends, you do get quite a rigid structure. So, it doesn't really bother me that it's so thin. I mean, if you were one of those people that knows that their models are going to get a really hard time, you might stick to 0.45 or maybe even something a little bit more bulletproof. But and similarly, I suppose if you had an outside, a garden layout, and your loco were running massive distances, then you might elect to have a more robust chassis, but it's just horses for courses, really. Mine's all made out of 0.45, apart from the boiler, which is 0.3. Was there somebody else with a question?
Yeah, another couple of questions. One from James Aitken, actually. I don't know why he couldn't ask his own. Do you cut the two frames together?
Yeah, I'll cut one out, And then basically I cut one out and offered it up to the loco to make sure that, you know, there were no conflicts, which there were. And then I had to cut a piece out here to, you know, get around the bottom of the. And then I soldered the one I cut to a piece of nickel silver, you know, just soldered it a bit around the edge, tacked it in place, and then just cut round it. And then, you know, file up to the, so that they both match, and then slit them apart and clean all the solder off. That's kind of how I do it. Rather than cutting two out, you know, measuring two and cutting two out. I think that route lies madness.
Okay, and
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Terry asks, and I'm not sure about this one, is the etch with boiler bands that appeared in the boiler video available commercially? If so, where?
Yes. Now I had these made. Again, Mick Davis took pity on me, and I just couldn't. Now then, Eileen's Emporium used to sell really thin brass strip, but the problem with it was obviously cut on guillotine, so it ends up forming in a helix, really, doesn't it? When you cut things on a guillotine, they always end up curling up. And they were okay, but Mick decided that he would etch me some. So these are etched brass ones, and they are they scale out at about 0.2 millimeters, maybe a bit less in thickness. It depends how much the etcher cooks them, to be honest with you. Sometimes they vary in thickness because of the way that the etching process works. And also they were done in consultation with my favourite painter, because he threatened me never to send him a model again that had any boiler bands on it, because he likes to just put make his own transfers for the boiler band lining, and likes to put them on himself, you know, and he reckons the thickness of the carrier film that he uses to draw the boiler bands on are about the right thickness for a boiler band anyway, and I dare say he's right. But I kind of ignored that, and he said, well, if you're going to do that, can you please make the boiler bands at least 1.6 millimeters wide, so that he's got a fighting chance of drawing the boiler band line and it not falling over the side of the boiler band. So these are kind of made specially with Warren Haywood in mind, and other painters are available. And Mick etched them, and they're available from Phil Atkinson at Hobby Holidays. He started selling them. Mick does etches. I can't remember. I think actually Phil sells them individually, so you can go on his website or ring him up and buy individual boiler bands, and they're about, I don't know, I would say maybe 8 inches long or something. If you're doing a little boiler for a tank engine, you can get 2 out of the length, but with something like this, it's 1 per length only. In fact, there's some offcuts here, look, on the bench, and they are, how are they in thickness? They're about 1.5 millimeters, something like that. And at Warren's recommendations, 1.6 wide, so that they'll accept a transfer without the transfer falling over the edge of the boiler band. So yeah, and I like using boiler bands because, for instance, when you solder the firebox to the boiler, you will inevitably end up with a little tiny gap all the way around there. And similarly here as well, when you butt in the boiler up to the smoke box, there'll always be a tiny gap. The boiler band conveniently disguises it, doesn't it? And if there's any imperfections in is circularity a word? If there's any difference in the
just circularity
of the firebox to the boiler, this will give you a little bit of wiggle room to disguise it as well. So that's the boiler band story. Phil Atkinson, Hobby Holidays. sells them.
Nick, I
Yes.
put a link in the chat box for specifically for Terry, but for obviously anybody else who wants to have a look.
Okay.
They're 50p.
Per boiler band.
Yeah.
Cheap at half the price. Cheap at double the price. Next question.
That's it for the moment. You can continue.
Oh, right. Okay. We'll crack on then. Yeah, great. Right. So at this stage, I think we've got our chassis, 2 chassis rails, one with all of the stairs attached to it. And the next thing to do, obviously, is to solder them together. And the way I do that is it follows. Let's put everything out of the way. You'll see that tonight I've been chatting to you, and on my workbench I've got a piece of plate glass. You can just see that, can't you? And if you just, you know, they're really good pieces of plate glass for using as a flatbed. So if you just go to your local sort of glazer's window place, I recommend that you buy laminated glass as well. I think this is 6mm or 8mm laminated glass that you might, safety glass that you would have to put in your shop for insurance purposes. And usually the glazers have got loads of offcuts of bits of glass like this, and they'll sell you them for buttons. And that's where I've got mine, and it's I've had it for years. It's got a couple of chips in it, but they won't matter. And then a piece of graph paper. I'll put these drawings to one side. I'll switch my soldering iron on. There we go. So what I usually do when I'm making a chassis is I use a pair of parallels and pop them on the graph paper and line the edges up with lines on the graph paper. Except that actually, the eagle-eyed amongst you'll notice that I haven't got any parallels. So what I've got is a square and the piece of aluminium that I was telling you about earlier, and they're about the same height, but they'll do for this job if you line everything up nicely. So what I do is I start by making sure that the parallels are sitting on lines on the graph paper, and then if you look from above, you need to then sort of line up this chassis rail with the by eye with the graph paper underneath. And then I get my jury axle that I mentioned earlier, and you can push jury axle through, or just a bog standard Slater's axle will do the trick. Just push that through the top hat bearing that I've soldered into the chassis, and that'll help you out in 2 ways. Number one, it'll help you locate the two chassis frames, and also it will act as a, you know, you'll be able to line that up with the graph paper underneath, and when the axle lines up with the lines on the graph paper, then you know that they're at 90 degrees to each other. Also, what I always do is just pop my rule there, just to make sure that the chassis is straight when you come to soldering it. Let's just unscrew the flux bottle. That's what wants to happen before, isn't it? Bear with me while I line everything up again. So again, straight edge is sitting on one of the lines, and so is this one. The chassis rails frames are now lined up with the lines on the graph paper, and just want to pop that on there to make sure that the frame's straight. And then you need to move one of the frames so that the axle is in line with the lines on the graph paper. So I'm sort of confident at this stage now that the whole thing's square. It's not doing that, and it's not doing that either, if you see what I mean. And then I'd be very brave and just put a little tack here on the this iron. Just one little tiny tack just there, like that. And then, because I've got my loco to hand, I can offer this up to the loco just to check that everything is where I want it to be. And it is. And that's moved slightly. So it's very naughty. That, and just tap that to there in the hope that we've not soldered the chassis to the foot plate. Double check this again. Our graph paper. I think that's moved very slightly, hasn't it? Yeah, as you can see, a little bit of time spent at this stage, just making sure that everything is nice and square. We'll pay dividends later. I think I've moved one slightly in relation to the other just to make sure that we've got a right angle. We can check that if you like with the rule. I'm pretty happy that the axle's spot on there. And then we'll go to the back of the chassis. We'll put a tack on that as well. So just put a little tack there. We'll do a bit of wet and dry there, so that I don't burn my finger. There we go, just a little tiny tack. Now we've got tacked together chassis. I'm pretty sure it'll sit quite nicely, and it will look in my most if it's been designed to go in there. And then if you're lucky enough to have a body that's such a nice fit, then you can use the chassis, use the body to hold everything while you tack it in a few more places. And what I'm trying to do wherever possible is put the tacks somewhere where you won't see them, because obviously that will help you a little bit later when it comes to cleaning everything up. Sorry about that, I've not put my foot on silent, have I? So there you have it. That's kind of a basic chassis done. So now all I need to do is spend 20 minutes just going around with my soldering iron and soldering everything up. First of all, let's razz that piece of solder off there. That's cracked over. Got a special tool for this that I put in the mini drill. It's a sort of an arbor with a rubber pad on that I just stick some discs of wet and dry paper that I cut out with double-sided tape, and they're pretty good. Just you can see that I did actually tack the chassis to the foot plate, but luckily it broke off very easily. Let's just this one more time just to be sure. See that? Fits very snugly. Everything's landed on the bottom of the foot plate. And if I can find my jury axle, I can pop that through there and you can see that that is a spot on a right angle to the frames. So I'm pretty confident that that's done. So we can just have some merry fun now with the soldering iron, just soldering all the stays to the frames and then cleaning it all up. So that's basically it.
Nick, while you're just doing that,
Yeah.
Philip Taylor again from the USA has
Yeah.
asked, how do you feel about using a RSU?
I've never used one. Is that a resistance soldering iron?
Yeah.
Never used one. I know people that use them and swear by them. I also know a lot of people, especially people from mainland Europe, that that build kits that use a flame, you know, a sort of a gas flame for doing soldering, and they swear by that. But I have to confess that I've never used either. I've always stuck to the traditional old soldering iron, and I think it's kind of maybe you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm just a bit too, you know, set in my ways or something like that. Perhaps the guy he could unmute himself and make a case for it or something. If he's interested in telling me if there would be any advantages to using an RSU here.
Would you like to unmute Phil and speak to
What do
Nick?
you think? What do you think, Phil?
Only if you're using thinner material. I've mainly used it in doing O-gauge track because you don't have to heat up you don't have to heat everything up as much to get everything to flow.
Right. Presumably, is the heat very localized where the two pieces of material touch then?
If you're using the right clip and the right probe, yes.
Right.
But there are different styles.
And if you were soldering something like this valance here to the foot plate, would the solder go all the way along? Would it just?
No, you not want to do that because you might run the risk of heating up adjacent pieces. So you're going to want to localize it still. It's just it's tap and go.
Right. I mean, there used to be a well-known member of the Gauge-O Guild called Raymond Wally, and he was a massive advocate of resistance soldering iron, and he used to use quite powerful magnets, you know, and the magnets had the advantage of, you know, the magnets were all cut at right angles, and he was able to use them to form, you know, right angles using the magnets and hold everything quite firmly and then solder it with an RSU. And that seemed to be quite a successful technique that he developed. But I have to confess, I've never even tried one. They look like a spot welder to me.
Probably never used one.
You've never used a spot welder,
but it works. I think it's similar to what I've seen done.
Yeah.
Nick, yeah, it's effectively the same thing because if you hold the probe on to an item too long at too high a current, it will actually start to burn, and you will get a burn in the material.
So it's actually well, of course, by physics, it's actually
it will pit it. It will pit it.
It's the resistance, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I use all three. I use soldering iron, RSU, and gas torch as well, depending what the item calls for.
I have to confess, I've never, very occasionally used a gas torch, usually to take things apart, but never really to solder things together. But I do know a lot of, that was a bad idea, putting chocolate in my mouth while I was chatting, wasn't it? But yeah, a lot of people a lot of sort of German and French modelers, for instance, you know, sort of they seem to have commercial kits that are kind of more designed to be used to be assembled with a gas flame rather than, you know, lots of the thin sheet that we use in the UK. A lot of the kits that I've seen seem to be they have a lot more castings in them, you know, and often the castings are of a massively high quality as well, you know, but the kits are very much more expensive than they are in the UK. I don't know whether anybody else has got any experience of that, but that's kind of my experience of it.
Do you want to ask a question, David?
Yes, I have. One's not so much a question of just the fact that I use an RSU quite a lot, and I find them absolutely excellent on nickel silver because it keeps the heat localized.
Yeah.
But also for putting in things like boiler bands, you can chase around those with that and using solder paste. Brilliant, absolutely wonderful for adding detail.
Right. Okay. Maybe I'll have to give it a go at some point. Does anybody actually sell RSUs these days?
London Road Models still do them, Nick.
Do they? I was told for a while that they were, you know, getting a bit difficult to get hold of as well. But good. Well, maybe I'll get one and have a go.
Are you doing a demo at Gildex? Oh no, you won't. You'll be doing the demo. You're doing this thing. You won't. You're doing the competition.
Well, yes, if the competition doesn't go ahead, maybe I will do a demo. I don't know. We're a bit light on entrants at the moment for the modelling competition. So if anybody that's watching has a model that they want to put in the modelling competition, then get your entries in, folks. You can get them in online. So really what I'm doing here is just going around and soldering up the various stays to the, I think I've kind of more or less tacked everything up now, haven't I? I don't know, verticals anyway. I don't like doing the horizontals because, as you saw earlier, it's very easy to solder the chassis to the foot plate and then not so easy to get them apart. I think I'm just going to leave that stay as it is because, as I said, that stay might end up being moved. It might end up here. It's designed really to go here, just in front of the front of the firebox, and then the motor could go inside here, and the gearbox could reach this axle here. I think that'd be a neater way of doing it. But if that would be the case, I have to take these top hat bearings out and then cut the frames there for a horn block. But that's something we can do at a later stage, I'm sure. So I'll just kind of continue soldering this up. If anybody else wants to ask me any questions.
Well, an observation from my point of view, Nick, is, you know, you've got an 040 effectively there. Sorry, you've got a 240 set of frames there.
Yeah.
And effectively, you've kind of got the middle axle fixed, haven't you?
Yeah. Does it matter which axle you drive?
Well, not in terms of what you drive, but, you know, depending upon what you do with the front pony wheels.
Well, I think on this loco, on the real thing, looking at, I mean, it's very difficult to tell from the drawing, but the gist I'm getting of it is that the front wheel isn't really you would have thought it might have been a radial truck, wouldn't you? But I'm not entirely sure that it is. I think it might just be in axle boxes, you know, that are fixed in the frames. Yeah. And it's just the end float, you know, that takes the loco around the curve. I mean, you have to remember in those days, well, in every railway's life, you know, there isn't such thing as a 6-foot radius scale curve, is there? I mean, we force locos to go around dinner plates almost, don't we? In the railway world. But I'm going to try and build it like that.
No, I was just thinking.
I've done this. I'm actually in a parallel universe building a pair of Cambrian tank locos that are also 240s, and I found just by having a little bit of end float in this wheel, the thing will go around a 6 foot radius curve, and it's got a wheelbase that's almost exactly the same as this. If you give me 5 seconds, I'll go and grab one and you'll be able to see.
Well, sorry, Nick, the point I was trying to get to was the fact you've got the middle axle fixed.
Yes.
And you've got the front and trailing axles in horn blocks.
Yes.
Is there any propensity for it to rock about the centre axle?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, no, because what I would do is when I'm starting to put weight inside this, I would bias it. So it's at the back half of the loco. And I would put some springs here on the top of the horn block for this front axle that would tend to push the loco up. And I think it'd travel quite nicely. You see, this is a very similar chassis that I've been building. This is for a Cambrian loco, and you can see it. The wheelbase is, well, it's a little tiny bit shorter, but and you can see how I've got the axle box there in a horn block. These are actually cast horn blocks, although sometimes I make my own. And you can see there's a little spring there. Look, the axle box is spring loaded there, so it does tend to push the front of the chassis up and stabilise the whole thing, and it does run quite nicely. The foot plate for it's over there, and if you pop a bit of lead weight on the foot plate, the thing runs really nicely, and it runs forwards and backwards through a 6 foot radius curve quite happily. And you can see I've been installing inside motion into this one. And this is a very similar layout, and I think this would have benefited from having the slide bars in here and everything. It would have made ultimately quite a nice loco, I think. But we may end up. My preference would always be to drive this one, to drive this axle. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure that. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it would do that? I'm kind of hoping not.
I mean, maybe others have got their own ideas, and we can open the floor to questions about this. But personally, I always remember it being mentioned. Don't fix the centre axle on a locomotive, and it seems like that. I mean, and to say it all depends upon how it works out, and what you do in the design. But it was always a case of don't fix the centre axle. You're going to have horn guides or horn blocks or stop springing or compensation.
Well, maybe in a future episode we'll find out. Eh?
Yeah, I'll book you in for next year already.
Well, has
anybody else got any thoughts on this about having a fixed centre axle on even though it's a 240 is effectively a 3-axle locomotive? Anybody? No?
I know that lots of people like to drive the centre. If it's a 6-coupled loco, then obviously lots of people like to drive the
drive the centre axle. Yeah,
drive the centre axle.
Go ahead, Dave.
I model in scale 7. Which is a bit tighter in terms of radius regarding to that. And I have to say that I find unless you put some degree of side play in the centre axle, that you won't get around the curves.
Can I ask when you're making things in scale 7, because I've only just recently built a few locos in scale 7. Do you use dead scale? Do you just take all the measurements straight off the GA?
Yes. The only difference I do is because the radius that you have to get round, as you so rightly say, is like a dinner plate by comparison to reality. So what I do is I tend to make sure there is a little bit of extra side play in the wheels. All wheels, I put side play in of about a millimetre.
Do you are the frames prototypically spaced, or are they a tiny bit narrower than they should be?
I make them dead spaced.
Right. Okay.
But
and how do you get on them with splashes in scale 7? I'm asking this because as a reference for the future.
If you make it all to scale, then you don't really run into a problem.
Right.
Problem only arises when it's not quite dead scale.
Right.
And the other thing you've got to make sure is that you don't leave horrible solder fillets inside the splashers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they grinds against the wheels, and it's
the thing about splashers, I was going to mention this about this loco actually, because it was something that I took into consideration when I was doing the kind of back of a fag packet design for this. The problem with fine scale, as we know, is that the back-to-backs are actually much narrower than they would be on a real loco. I don't know what is the back-to-back in scale 7.
a back-to-back of these. Oh no, you're asking
31 point something, isn't it?
Yeah, 31.5, I think.
Yeah, because that's a massive difference from fine scale, which is 29.2.
Correct.
And the problem that you have with splashers, and as I'll explain, is that often splashers on a loco have got a back, haven't they? That you see the front, but they've also got a back, and usually the back of the splasher fits between the outside face of the frames and the wheel, the back of the wheel, doesn't it? So you need
what you've got to remember is we've thinned the wheel down as well.
Yeah, what, to below
to the standard,
to the dead scale.
The dead scale, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you take something off the front, something off the back, and reprofile the flange as well.
Yeah, yeah. Colin Dowling does all that, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, he does his, I do mine.
Right, okay.
A number of people do their own.
Yeah.
I've got 17 locos so far, so.
Right. Because on my back of fag packet calculation, one of the things that I was thinking of when I was, thinking about how I was drawing this out was to make sure that there is enough room to get the back of these splashers down between the back of the wheel and the and I mean, you've got at least the thickness of the bearing there to work with. So if you make the back of the splasher out of really thin material, then it always works in fine scale. And I just wondered how you got on in scale 7. I mean, a lot of people miss the back of the splasher off, don't they? But then with a loco like this, when you're looking underneath the boiler there, you can see the back of the wheel on the other side, and that just looks a bit crap, really, doesn't it?
There is one little trick you can play, which, especially if you've got tight radiuses. I mean, I've actually got scale 7 locomotives, 242s, 262s around a 5-foot radius curve.
Right.
Which in theory is not possible, but if you put onto the back of the splashers and the front of the splashers, for that matter, magic tape. I don't know if you know what magic tape is.
I do.
What the draftsmen use for repairing, at least what they used to use. They don't do it anymore, I don't suppose. You can put that on the back of the flashers. It never comes off. At least I've never had it come off.
Right.
It provides a smooth surface which doesn't allow the wheel to touch the chassis and cause electrical problems.
Yeah. I've done that. I did that once in the past, and it did work. It was on an 044 loco, and the rear bogie, the wheels had little tiny splashers that went over the tops of the wheels, and I lined the inside of those with magic tape. I should say it's really, really, really thin, isn't it? And it just gives you a nice little sort of membrane. So if the if the flange does,
touch it,
skim by the panel work, at least it doesn't short out.
Nick,
One day all this will be irrelevant, really, won't it, when we're using battery power? So.
While we're talking about it, I actually have my hand up. I noticed that you've got a pot of, is it solder or is it flux to your right? Yes.
Yeah, it's a very old bottle that some kind of gauge master flux came in, and I always put it in. This is the lid off an aerosol, and I do that to stop me knocking it over. because I found that I was knocking the bloody thing over all the time and flooding my bench with.
My question is it flux or is it solder?
It's flux. I just use it's phosphoric acid.
Yeah,
Just bog standard phosphoric acid.
I use 12%, but
This is in fact 12% phosphoric acid. I mean, you can make it up yourself, can't you?
yeah, you can. I do. It's a lot cheaper.
I mean, I've no idea where you would get phosphoric acid from, but I'm sure you could get it on the internet, couldn't
Well,
you?
I don't know whether you can or not. I bought a litre of it, and of course, if you're diluting it to 12%,
You get a lot.
It lasts more years than you're going to live.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say for you know, that if you're using phosphoric acid, it's quite important that, like for instance, as soon as this demonstration's over, I will run downstairs and wash everything in bicarbonate of soda. Just get some sodium hydrogen carbonate. You can get it from any food shop, can't you? From any supermarket, because it's sodium bicarbonate you would use if you were baking cake.
I use a cleaner, which is called Magic Blue. I don't know if anybody's come across it. It's designed
is that alkaline as well?
Yes, it is alkaline,
Yeah.
but it's designed for cleaning commercial kitchen surfaces.
Right. Okay.
So it's totally safe.
Yeah.
But boy, does it clean. But
Yeah.
I would give you a warning when I'm working with nickel silver. A little while ago, I was doing an Armstrong, and I put the copper chimney on, dropped it in the ultrasonic bath for 20 minutes, and it came out black all over.
Oh, right. No.
So there obviously is some electrolysis took place between the copper and the nickel silver.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no problem, but just doesn't look anywhere near as nice as it did when it went.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just as soon as we finish here, I'll run off downstairs and just knock a little bit of bicarbonate of soda in the palm of my hand, and I've got a big brush here, and I just dip it in some water, and then just smear that over everything that I've soldered on that soldering session, and you can actually see the you know, the acid and the bicarb reacting. You get bubbles of hydrogen, won't it? That's given off.
A good late friend of mine called John Day, some of you may know him, unfortunately passed away about 6 months ago. He did that with a loco he'd virtually finished building with white metal fittings on it all. And then he put it in a bath of soda and then went to bed. And when he came down in the morning, he was most disappointed with what he found.
And that's all in the past as well.
Oh, yes. So don't leave it for long.
No. I just leave it until the fizzing's stopped, and then and it does work. You can see this is kind of got. I mean, I did this a few weeks ago, and it's got hardly any sort of. It's copper 2 oxide, isn't it? Verdigris that starts to appear. The green.
Straightforward baking soda.
It's what, sorry?
Straightforward baking soda.
Straightforward baking soda is a pretty good alkali for neutralising phosphoric acid, because phosphoric acid's only a weak acid, and bicarbonate of soda is a weak base, so they work quite well together. You know, you don't need caustic soda, sodium hydroxide, or anything like that. Listen to me talking as if I know something about chemistry.
Nick?
Yes.
Peter Dalton says he bought an Adams Class 12 042 locomotive, central fixed and driven axle, and I could not get it to go around my curves. That was 1580mm radius, which I think is 62 inches, and it pops off the back axle. He said needed to put a small pony truck on the rear.
Right. Well, that's,
he should be able to get it round if you put side play in. Just needs to stretch the side play slightly.
Yeah, but if it's a bought one though, it depends how much you can do with it. Stripping the axle, stripping the chassis back to give him more side play. It might be causing him more grief than it's worth.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite happy with that, folks. There we are. There's a chassis look, ready to go, and it looks quite rigid. And you can see what I did here. This is the portion of the footplate that sticks up above the, sorry, the section of the chassis that sticks up above the footplate. This part of it is part of the chassis. This part of it here is a bit that I cut out and soldered on, and they just about meet up there. I'm kind of hoping that when I put the spring detail on here, that this spring detail here, that this will, you know, kind of cover up that gap. But I think I'm going to be unlucky, aren't I? I think it's will have to be dressed up a bit so that they match a little bit better than that. But,
are you planning inside motion?
No, well, I'm kind of building this for someone else. Right at the beginning of this process, I put an advert on the, I think it was in the modelling section of the Gauge Guild's forum, saying, does anybody want a smoke box making? Because I'm doing a demonstration of how to make a smoke box. And this guy sent me the drawing. He said, would you mind making this? And I kind of quite like the idea of it because it's quite an elegant shaped smoke box, isn't it? That's got a nice pleasing curve there at the bottom, rather than it just being a straight keyhole shape. And I think it's relieved here, isn't it? So that the springs, these springs fit inside that curve there. And I kind of quite liked it. So I built him his smoke box, and then, as I said earlier, I had to build another one because I didn't realise that the drawing shrinks. And I've just ended up carrying on making all the sections. So this is I mean, it's kind of a freebie, really. So this is for him, really. You know.
When I'm making my frames, I start off by soldering two sheets together.
Yeah.
And then I find you only need to do one lot of cutting out.
Oh, of course, yeah.
It you know, you can still leave them soldered together even when you're trying it as a fit before you part them up. So what fits one side will fit the other.
Yeah. Well, it's just habit, isn't it? Really, it's that. If I'm honest with you, every time I make something like a chassis, there's often a Mark II, isn't there? You know, because you've always often you miss something off, don't you? Or in the case of this one, I had to cut it here.
Yeah.
To relieve it there for the bottom of the firebox, you know, and but sometimes there is a Mark II. If you look over there in the scrap bin, you'll see a lot of the Mark Is. But it's just force of habit, really, isn't it? Just get one, and then you can offer it up to the loco, and then cut another one once it's to your satisfaction. I'm not entirely sure what happens here inside the cab because I suppose these are splashers, aren't they? And the bit of the frame here, probably the cab floor, you can see that the frame sticks up here inside the cab. And I think my idea there was that probably the cab floor, and I think it does, doesn't it? The cab floor sits on the chassis here. I suppose that's how a real loco would be done. And then it's got like a box, hasn't it, inside the cab? I suppose it's a kind of a bench and a cupboard for putting your sandwiches and your flask or something, and or a bait box, as they would call them in the southeast, or a snap tin, as we call them in Yorkshire. And then there's a kind of a box here, isn't there, inside that hides that becomes the splasher for the back, for the rear wheel. That's quite an interesting thing. I might be tempted actually to move the drive to this axle actually, and then cut these out. But then you'll end up with both of the axle boxes then will be compensated, although that's not really a problem, is it?
No.
I don't see that as being a problem at all. Often, I mean, I kind of read somewhere once, I think it might have been in the Guild's technical manual, that it's always good practice to have the axle that's driven by the motor fixed in the chassis. but I don't know actually in
I
practice whether that matters, to be honest with you.
No,
I
it doesn't.
bring
It doesn't.
those up, but I drive from the back axles always as well. It
Yeah.
tends to just make a smoother run, I find.
You think?
Nick,
Yes.
Nick, the 440s I've recently built have all been compensated.
Right.
No fixed axles.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the loco over there that I showed you earlier runs okay. And I've built quite a lot of locos where I've changed my mind halfway through and all the axles are compensated, and they run just as well, I think, as the ones where everything's compensated.
I spring all my axles.
Yeah. Do you spring them, or do you use the system that I showed you earlier where it sits on an end stop and the spring just moves because often in 7mm the horn blocks are they sit on an end stop, don't they?
Yes.
And they move downwards, don't they, into any undulations?
Yeah. I tend to actually make mine sprung if I possibly can, though I must admit some of them have got end stops. But
Right.
I find springing them produces a much better run, much smoother run. But it can also have some issues with regards to staying on the track, getting them around tight corners. So you've got to be a bit careful. It's horses for courses.
Well, on the real thing, of course, they would put each wheel on a set of scales, wouldn't they, and adjust the springs until you've got.
Well, I put them on a set of scales. Everything I've got runs at 2 ounces per axle.
All right. Okay.
So I use a small druggies scale, I think they're called. I'll get arrested one day. But I've got a bit of track with them, and most of the loco stays on the track, but 2 sets of the wheels actually sit over this small scale pad.
Right.
I set them up for 2 ounces per axle.
Right. Oh, that's quite interesting. Yeah, I always, if I'm building a loco, I always if it's a Pacific loco, I always shoot for about 1.5 kilos, you know, so it's got a fighting chance of pulling a decent sized train. But these days it gets a bit difficult because often people want you need quite a big decoder in the loco if it's going to pull 12 bogies, you know, one of those sort of double O gauge V5s or whatever the Zemo equivalent is, might not have enough headroom in the rectifier to you know, to provide the current that you need to set off a big train. And then obviously people these days want a pretty hefty speaker inside it as well, don't they, for to get some nice sound. And everyone these days should have some kind of capacity, you know, a kind of a Stay Alive or whatever you know the various brand names of them are, and they start taking up quite a lot of space in the boiler.
I use soundtracks decoders.
Use what? Sorry,
soundtracks decoders. Yeah.
Yeah, but whatever you use, it starts to take up quite a lot of space in the boiler, which kind of then limits the amount of ballast that you can get in. And I sometimes find that's a bit of a problem, you know. And I don't really like putting decoders in the tender because you end up with a really thick wiring harness, don't you, of cables going between them.
Yeah.
To power up all the various devices.
What sort of pickups do you use?
I only ever use wipers. I had a really bad experience donkeys years ago with those Slater's plunger pickups, and I decided I would never go there again. They always use, to my mind, they always put a little bit too much resistance. You know,
I've used Slater's pickups, which I modified to have carbon tips in the end.
Right. Okay.
But I have to say, of late, I've been finding that the springs they're currently using, if they draw something like about 150 milliamps, and that's quite low because I still use Porter Scout motors.
Yeah.
But I'm finding what's happening is after a few years, the tension is going out the spring.
All right. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
So recently, I'm changing.
Do you think that's because the spring is a conductor?
Yeah, I think it gets hot, Mildly hot, but I don't know. I don't know why it should, because in theory, the pickup is soldered at the end of a brass rod.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
no reason the current should flow through the spring, but
No, it shouldn't theoretically, should it? I mean, I remember years ago building something, and the problem was that I'd really not set up the plunger pickups properly. The springs were pretty deep, or there wasn't really enough space between the outsides of the frames and the backs of the wheels, and the plunger needed to have a certain amount of travel, you know, because in those days some of the Slater's wheels were pretty wobbly. I mean, I have to say Slater's products have improved immeasurably since they've opened their new factory in Darley-Dale. You know, they've got sort of a state-of-the-art industrial unit now, and the quality of the machining that they do down there has just improved no end. David White, I had this long chat with him once, and he was telling me that he used to be in an old school, didn't he, in Matlock, Bath?
They did. Well, old school, I think it was an old mine.
And he said the floors in the building weren't very stable, so the CNC machines that they had used to wobble all over the place, you know, and the quality of some of the parts, and also they used to get the axles machined somewhere else in a factory in Brum, and he said the quality wasn't very good. The squares on the ends were all of kind of variable size, so didn't always fit in his wheels, you know. There are all kinds of issues with them, weren't there? But these days there isn't. But because the wheel wobbled a bit, I don't know, I just had a bad experience with the plungers. They just seem to put too much resistance into the wheel, so it takes that little bit more effort, doesn't it, for the motor to turn the wheel.
It does.
And then if you're driving this axle and there's a little bit of extra tolerance in the crank pin here, then that's translated to here, and the tolerance doubles, doesn't it? And then it goes here, and the tolerance is tripled. And you know, the resistance of the on the wheels caused by the plungers was causing the chassis to sort of lock up. And I had a really bad experience with it, and I just gave up. And these days I just buy phosphor bronze wire.
Well, I've gone over to split chassis.
Oh, you use split chassis there. Because the thing about fuzzy bronze wire is you can just hide it in a very small space, you know, and it always seems to be reliable. You can tweak it, can't you? So you get a nice amount of tension. So when it's at its maximum reach, you know, it's nearly at the point where it's relaxed, so that, you know, you've got a little bit of end float, and the axle, the wire's not got much tension in it. Now I kind of like that, because you don't get quite as much resistance then on the wheels when they're moving, and that always helps you out, I think.
Yeah, if it's a tender locomotive, it's relatively easy to use the American system.
Yeah. Have you ever had problems? Has anybody ever had problems with the American system shorting out on the train?
Only if the one coming the other way is headlamp to headlamp.
Right. Because sometimes, I made one once for somebody ages ago, and I kind of completely forgot the fact that I hadn't insulated the buffers and the drawbar from the tender. So the tender was all one polarity, and then somewhere down the train, you know, it was maybe one of the wheels on one of the bogies on the train was touching a brake block or something, and that was shorting the whole train out, you know, because once you connected it up using the metal 3-link couplings or screw-link couplings or whatever, you know, it was everything then became, you know, the same polarity, didn't it, as the tender. You know, and I don't know, there's an American guy, isn't there, here tonight? Perhaps he could throw some light on that. And what's the...
Well, I always insulate the buffers with araldite, just a very thin skim over the top. And the hooks I isolate again by mounting them through a Paxilin. Paxilin.
I mean, perhaps a better way of doing it would be to put some insulating material between, because a lot of, I don't know, all the UK models that I've seen have got, the tenders have got a dummy in chassis, haven't they? And it'd be very easy, wouldn't it, just to insulate that from the rest of the tender.
Very easy indeed.
Yeah, you could just put a skim of, you know, some plastic card or even some insulating tape, couldn't you, on the top, and that'd be that, really.
Nick,
Yes.
I know we're drawing this to a close in a minute, but one of our attendees tonight, who I don't have a name of, has asked, what kind of entries do you need for the modelling competition?
All kinds of entries. Locomotives, rolling stock, scenery. Please feel free to enter. We're always a bit low on numbers at this stage in the year, and it always kind of revives itself. But it doesn't hurt, does it, to give it a plug on an occasion like this? Get your entries in, everybody, especially you lot that have come to a scratch building demonstration that are obviously, you know, pretty good builders yourselves. So please get your entries in. Enter online. No point in sending me a letter. You all obviously know you're all tech savvy enough to log on to a Zoom meeting, so you can go onto the Guild's website and find competitions and click on the drop down box, and you'll see there's an online entry form there that's very easy to fill in. And then you get a day out at Stafford, don't you? A wonderful new venue. So yeah, it's coming on all right. So essentially, the guy's getting himself. You know, I kind of built this bit by bit as a demonstration for and it's not finished off as nicely as I would do something for myself, you know. But it is a freebie, isn't it? So you know, I think he can file off a bit of excess solder, can't he?
Right, everyone. I think we're coming to an end.
Everybody's got a last question. Now's your chance.
I don't think there is there, Ian?
David, I think, wants to ask a question.
Very quickly. This is the first one I've actually attended. For some reason or other, I've previously missed all of the invitations, but do they come automatically?
No, you have to register interest via the website, as you would have done for tonight. So basically, on the Guild website, and just book for a ticket or book for a space for the next evening with.
Okay, I need to go back each time and book it. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, because they generate they're all individually generated tickets effectively for each session.
All right, that's fine.
Pleasure, David.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Nick, and thank you very much for everybody for attending today.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Yeah, and we look forward to the next one.
Do we know what the next one is?
July. Yes, I do. The next one is John Gay, who works at Digitrains. He's doing a session specifically on installing DCC chipsets into a low gauge locomotive. I believe it's going to be a Class 31 diesel, but he's also obviously going to be on hand to take questions and give any advice or help if you're having issues with DCC.
Yeah,
very nice, Nick.
There's the loco as we stand so far. So maybe next time we'll put some wheels on the chassis and get the chassis running nicely. That's always something, isn't it, that we get inundated with a little bit at shows. People that have got locos that bind up can't really run quite as nicely as they thought. Perhaps we'll go there.
Right. Well, thanks very much again, everybody. And
okay, then.
I will bring this to a close.
You're welcome.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.